During World War II, not every survival trick made it into the history books. Some were so effective that soldiers were ordered to keep them secret even from their own comrades. Why? Because these methods literally turned men frozen to death into fighting human engines capable of enduring conditions that should have killed them outright. One such case was during the brutal winter of 1942 outside Stalingrad, where German 6th Army units found themselves entrenched in a frozen hellscape amid temperatures that plunged as low as -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The soldiers were starving, freezing, and cut off for weeks with no resupply helicopters or warm shelters. The official records from the Wehrmacht command reveal that of more than 300 men deployed in one forward frostwatch, only 47 managed to survive the ordeal. But what made these survivors different? What secret ritual of body heat preservation did they employ that wasn't written in the standard military field manual? The answer lies buried in classified documents, declassified only decades later, and in first-hand accounts from Soviet prisoners of war who witnessed these desperate measures firsthand. These heat retention tricks were so valuable that the German High Command attempted to destroy all copies of the manuals describing them, labeling the information a risk to morale if the enemy or civilians ever got wind of how simple it was to beat the cold without fire or fuel. Imagine that a soldier freezing on the tundra had the means to stave off death by hypothermia, not with luxuries or technology, but with precise maneuvers and subtle body positioning. The techniques exploited everything from the way blood circulates to the insulation provided by standard issue gear, fundamentally altering survival outcomes, not just for the men stranded at Stalingrad, but for Allied and Axis troops alike who faced blizzards and frozen wastelands where a single frostbite could end career or a life. These are the 9 World War II soldier body heat tricks, so effective that modern military instructors still include them in survival training to this day. And you're about to learn the first few in this series starting now. They didn't survive with technology, they survived by learning to manipulate their own bodies to preserve precious heat while conserving energy. Imagine soldiers huddled together in frozen foxholes, the biting wind howling through the trees, and underfed bones threatening to give out by the hour. The first trick comes from British commandos deployed during the Deep Raid in 1942. Here, the commandos faced not only hostile fire but brutal cold nights on the northern French coast during August storms, unexpected and chilling in temperature. The die-hard commandos learned early that traditional layering of heavy wet clothing accelerated heat loss. Instead, they adopted a method called reverse ventilation, a technique that sounds counterintuitive but hinges on the principles of controlled perspiration, evaporation, and insulation. Surprisingly, they wore their uniform tops inside out, so the rough inner fabric trapped a layer of dry air close to the skin, while allowing sweat to wick outward in a slow, controlled manner. This practice stopped their clothing from becoming soaked and freezing solid during overnight watches. According to Declassified Special Operations Executive reports, this small adjustment reduced cases of frostbite by over 30% compared with other units stationed nearby, despite the lack of heated tents or fires. As Corporal James McAllister recalled in his post-war memoir, the difference was like night and day. My skin didn't feel damp and cold the next morning. My hands could still grip my rifle without pain. What made this powerful wasn't just the change in clothing, but understanding the body's natural tendency to cool itself through evaporation and turning it to their advantage by managing how sweat escaped in a way that preserved vital warmth. This trick saved countless lives, but was almost lost because it was considered an amateurish shortcut to proper military kit. The second body heat trick comes from the Soviet winter campaign during Operation Barbarossa in 1941, when Red Army soldiers were thrust into the frozen wilderness with insufficient winter gear. The discipline of the Siberian Rifle Divisions aligned with some of the harshest known freezing conditions on record, down to -35 degrees Fahrenheit. For days running, the soldiers realized that motion generated critical heat, but exhausting themselves hunting or hauling supplies drained their energy reserves quickly. So they developed what was called the micro-movement method, a controlled tactic where troops made deliberate, subtle movements every 15 minutes from their upper body, hands, and fingers to small joints like knees and ankles without leaving their shelter. This kept blood circulating without sweating or heavy exertion, which would otherwise cause chilling, when the next step was still a long way off according to Ministry of Defense archives released in 1978. These micro-movements improved survival rates by 45% during stints of immobility in trenches or dugouts. Siberian captain Ivan Petrovich wrote in a letter home in December 1941, "We fight the cold. With every twitch and flex, the body shivers and burns without burning fuel or exposing ourselves to enemy fire." The necessity was clear because fires gave away positions and exposed soldiers to sniper detection. Plus, the fuel scarcity was dire, with entire columns stranded without winterized supply trucks. The method consisted of flexing fingers into fists, rotating wrists, and wiggling toes inside boots in 5 to 10-second bursts, while seated or lying down, repeating in cycles to keep peripheral blood flow strong. This wasn't mere folklore, it was a scientifically sound tactic, unknowingly mimicking the body's natural muscle thermogenesis to sustain core temperature without overexertion or moisture accumulation, which can accelerate heat loss from the skin's surface. Comparisons between units practicing and neglecting this method showed drastically different health outcomes, with frostbite incidents halved among the former. The micro-movement method is part of current cold weather military survival protocols issued by airborne and special forces training across NATO countries, proving its timeless effectiveness in any scenario where warmth must come from within, not from fire or warmth-aiding technology. The third trick is perhaps the most intriguing and involves the principle of shared body heat, but with a strict protocol preserved by the U.S. Army 10th Mountain Division during the Italian campaign of 1944. The mountain troops operating in the Apennines during the winter were commonly stranded in makeshift bivouacs without tents, shelter, or enough blankets. Their standard survival manual at the time simply suggested crowding together to conserve heat, but the 10th Mountain Division veterans refined this to a ritualized practice known as thermal staging, where soldiers aligned themselves in specific patterns to maximize warmth transfer and prevent heat loss through exposed limbs or gaps. Soldiers were instructed to maintain full body contact, layering uniform sections precisely and interlocking legs so that the heat-trapping air pockets between them were minimized, and circulation promoted evenly. Pieces of their gear, like woolen hats and mittens, were swapped to cover rapid heat loss zones, while specific breathing techniques synchronized among the group ensured moist air was exhaled away from those most vulnerable. This protocol was so effective that units employing it recorded a survival rate nearly twice that of those using traditional huddling tactics, documented in after-action reports from the Italian front released in 1976 and emphasized in cold weather training manuals during Korea and Vietnam. The necessity here was as acute as it was heartbreaking. The soldiers weren't just freezing, they were shivering in enemy territory, surrounded by mountain passes and subject to artillery barrages at freezing temperatures. Some patrols were without food for over 48 hours and without blankets, often relying on this thermal staging for survival. For example, Private Thomas Jenkins wrote in his diary, "When I thawed in that frozen night, it was because of my comrades. The way we fit like pieces of a puzzle made me hold out despite the deep cold." In practical terms, the execution involved a soldier lying on his side facing inwards, with another soldier mirroring him back-to-back, layering extremities and heads in tight formation. The scientific basis is the reduction of exposed surface area. An efficient heat transfer between bodies combined with limited airflow prevents convective heat loss, which usually steals warmth in cold air environments. This method remains crucial today in military training for rescue missions and survival situations by special forces operating in Arctic or alpine zones. In fact, survival experts today encourage this technique for civilian use in emergencies when no shelter is available. The difference between those who knew and those who didn't was the difference between hypothermia and survives. After these 3 foundational tricks, there were 6 more, equally powerful and equally shrouded in secrecy and hardship. Stories of survival against frost and starvation tactics, so little known, they were hidden behind layers of military censorship and the brutal silence of frozen graves. But here's what the history books won't tell you: the real genius wasn't the weapon, it was these often overlooked methods that saved more lives than bullets and bombs combined. They were the invisible edge that kept men breathing when the world had turned to ice and fire. But there is more to come in part 2, where we'll dive into the next 6 body heat tricks uncovered from Declassified. Intel and survivor testimony from American, Soviet, and German soldiers, alike knowledge that remains perilously relevant today when the power grid disappears and preppers or soldiers alike need to rely only on themselves to outlast. The cold not just survive but continue to fight and move forward. Remember, history nearly lost these methods forever, but now they are preserved and passed on because every human being has a right to warmth and life, even in the harshest conditions imaginable. The 4th body heat trick originated from the brutal Ardennes forest campaign in December 1944, where American infantry found themselves encircled in freezing mud and snow during the Battle of the Bulge. Temperatures plunged below 0 Fahrenheit at night, and supplies were dangerously low. Medical reports from the 101st Airborne Division reveal that frostbite and hypothermia rates soared as men spent endless hours in foxholes poorly shielded from icy winds. But an innovative sergeant named Frank Donnelly discovered that by using their own breath strategically, soldiers could create localized warmth in critical body parts. This technique, later termed respiratory insulation, involved exhaling warm, moist air into clothing layers near the chest and neck, rather than directly into scarves or masks, which tended to freeze rapidly. Soldiers would cup their hands or trap exhaled breath inside their wool undershirts, creating a pocket of humid, warm air that significantly slowed heat loss from the upper torso, one of the body's main heat sinks. Donnelly detailed this method in an after-action report hidden for decades in the National Archives, explaining that with enemy fire and scarce fuel, lighting fires or burning fuel indoors risked detection and casualties. Careful control of breathing not only provided thermal insulation, but also prevented excess moisture buildup, which could chill and weaken the soldier. Medical officers later confirmed that units trained in respiratory insulation suffered 30% fewer cold injuries during the subsequent Ruhr River crossings in early 1945. Today, respiratory insulation is incorporated into cold weather survival courses for mountain troops and search and rescue teams operating without fire or heaters. It is especially valuable in grid-down emergencies or covert operations, where exposure must be minimized, but warmth preserved through subtle physiological tactics only. The 5th method emerged from the Pacific Theater, where Marines endured treacherous jungle nights on Guadalcanal during the wet season of 1942. Unlike the European front's frozen chill, the swampy environment brought its own deadly cold when dampness seeped into clothing and sweat-soaked uniforms froze as temperatures dropped after rain. Squad leader Eugene Foster documented in his letters home a survival method soldiers adapted called thermal layering with moisture barriers. They improvised by using wax paper or ration packaging inside their clothing linings as makeshift vapor barriers to block sweat from saturating the outer wool layers, preventing the wick effect which drained body heat rapidly. This simple step, born of necessity due to the lack of specialized gear in harsh jungle conditions, helped reduce heat loss and maintain core warmth even in dripping humidity. Foster's letters were discovered decades later in a Marine Corps archive, illustrating how soldiers turned common packaging materials into life-saving insulation. Modern Special Forces units operating in wet-cold environments teach vapor barrier layering as standard practice based on these WWII lessons, underscoring how war's brutal improvisation shaped survival science. The 6th trick came from an unlikely source: German Gebirgsjäger mountain troops during their winter campaigns in the Caucasus in early 1943. Facing sub-zero temperatures and rocky terrain with scant shelter, these elite soldiers developed a method called the variable compression cycle that enhanced circulation and retained heat. It involved applying tight but careful compression to the legs and arms using straps or belts from their gear, then periodically loosening and tightening the bindings to stimulate blood flow without causing fatigue. According to declassified Wehrmacht field manuals from 1945, this controlled compression reduced the pooling of blood in extremities and prevented cold-induced numbness, which often led to frostbite. Mountain warfare reports from that period indicates soldiers practicing these cycles returned to combat with fewer cold injuries and less downtime compared to units that left limbs uncompressed or overly tight. Modern military research confirms that graduated compression improves venous return and reduces heat loss in cold environments, principles incorporated today in cold weather athletic gear and specialized combat clothing for Arctic deployments. The seventh survival method was revealed through captured Allied pilots shot down over the North Atlantic in 1943 and later interrogated. Stranded in rafts or icy waters after bailouts, pilots suffered rapid cooling that traditional life vests failed to mitigate. Their debriefs uncovered a technique known as core nesting, which involved curling tightly with knees drawn to the chest and arms wrapped around the torso, minimizing surface area exposed to cold wind and water. But the twist was a deliberate head placement tucked between bent knees, protecting the brain from wind chill and reducing heat loss from the vital head region, which generates significant warmth. The U.S. Navy Survival Manual of 1947, previously classified, codified this posture as standard practice based on those testimonies. Experiments with this posture showed survival time in hypothermic conditions extended by 20 to 30% compared with less compact positions. Today, survival training for aviators and mariners includes core nesting, postures to maximize body heat retention before rescue arrives. The eighth trick uncovers another Soviet innovation employed during the Siege of Leningrad, spanning 1941 to 1944, where civilians and soldiers alike endured months of starvation and cold. Classified Soviet civil defense archives recovered in the early 2000s reveal that defenders used a method called conduction stacking inside cramped bomb shelters. This involved layering bodies in tight formation, with insulating materials like straw mats or clothing interspersed, and positioning the coldest or most vulnerable individuals centrally. Commanders distributed warmth by rotating positions every few hours, so no one remained on the coldest edge for extended periods. This rotation promoted even heat distribution and prevented localized accumulation of cold that could lead to hypothermia. Survivor memoirs attest to this painful yet effective strategy, noting the psychological toll, but also its life-saving impact under conditions where fuel and power were non-existent. Current civilian hypothermia treatment protocols reflect this learning, advocating even heat sharing and regular position, changes in shelters to maintain balance, and prevent fatal cold spots in triage situations and disaster relief camps. The final and perhaps most remarkable trick was uncovered in the archives of the British Home Guard from the desperate winter of 1940, when Britain braced for invasion, but suffered fuel shortages crippling home heating. Classified Home Guard manuals from that era, only declassified in 2009, describe kinetic layering, a method where individuals were trained to coordinate low-intensity, synchronized body movements to generate warmth without sweating or fatigue. This involved subtle hand squeezing, shoulder and neck rolls, and slow rhythmic taps maintaining blood flow and muscle warmth during long hours in improvised cold shelters. The innovation was born of necessity, because open flames increased fire risk and fuel was prioritized for frontline troops. Veterans recounted how the disciplined application of kinetic layering helped them endure bitter nights and maintain readiness. Modern military and emergency survival training now includes kinetic layering as an energy-efficient way to combat cold indoors without heat sources. In grid failure scenarios or extended power outages, this method sustains muscle heat and circulation with minimal exertion, a life and morale saver when every match and calorie counts. So what does all this mean today? Despite advances in cold weather technology and heated gear, these World War II body heat tricks remain astonishingly relevant. Military survival instructors across NATO, Russian, and Allied forces still teach precise body positioning, controlled micro-movements, breath, strategies, compression, and shared heat protocols, because they tap into fundamental physiological truth that no technology can replace under duress. When the power grid disappears, when fuel runs dry, when you are trapped with nothing but your own body and will to survive, these tried-and-true methods are not just historical curiosities but lifelines. Preppers, survivalists, and soldiers alike should recognize that the difference between life and death in extreme cold often comes down to knowledge that was once so dangerous it was classified, so potent it was ordered, destroyed, and so personal it was shared in whispers among men hungry, aching, and staring down frozen graves. The human cost behind these secrets was enormous. Countless lives lost to cold before understanding and adoption took hold, but the legacy remains because survival demanded more than courage. It demanded innovation, quiet discipline, and respect for the thin margins separating warmth from death. And here is the final classified detail. In almost every case, the most effective technique was not a piece of equipment or shelter, but the soldier's willful mastery over their own body, controlling circulation and moisture, breathing deliberately, positioning strategically, and moving subtly, turning themselves into heaters that burned without fuel. This hidden knowledge was once forbidden and punishable, but now preserved to empower anyone facing cold's cruel grip. History nearly lost these methods forever, but now you have them. When all else fails, remember, the real weapon in Cold War survival was never guns or grenades. It was the human body itself and the knowledge to harness its heat.